Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. Today on the podcast, I'm speaking with Shannon Traphagen about the loss of the love of her life and best friend from brain cancer. She so beautifully describes feeling rudderless and lost after having spent all her adult life with her husband. Before his diagnosis, they were on the road of adoption, but due to his illness, they also lost that option. Shannon slept downstairs on the couch for a year to avoid the loneliness of the bedroom she had shared with her husband and the baby's room across the hallway. She slowly worked her way back into embracing her life and now helps others through her podcast. Shannon speaks about vulnerability and loneliness, a topic she feels not discussed enough in grief.
Vulnerability really isn't talked about enough, and that was something I wish I knew going in, was that I would feel such vulnerability, such nakedness after his death. And the fact that secondary losses are a very real thing, and I wasn't prepared for that. And so that is something that I wish I had known, that I want others to know, because that really impacts your healing.
About this week's guest. Shannon Traphagen is a published author, motivational grief and loss speaker, patient advocate, and the host of the Game on Glio podcast, a show centered around the stories of brain cancer patients, caregivers, doctors, researchers, therapists, and grief and loss journeys. With a background in magazine publishing, social work, and modern media, Shannon is also walking through her own grief journey after losing her 45-year-old husband to glioblastoma 2 years ago. She now helps others through her podcast and her own experiences, bridging the gap in communication between patient, family, widows, and the medical community. She is also the founder of Traphagen's Trail Ride for Brain Cancer, a cycling fundraiser which has raised over $30,000 to date for brain cancer clinical trials. Please enjoy today's episode. So welcome, Shannon. It's so nice to have you here on the podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty good. Today is a good day. We'll say that.
So why don't we start with you telling the listener a little bit about your story of loss and trauma?
Sure. So I really started going through my experience of my grief and my trauma back in 2019. I had experienced loss just like anybody else had growing up, where you lose a grandparent, you lose an uncle who I'd lost when he was in his 50s. So it's not that I had never really seen death or experienced a loss before. I never had it hit so close to home. And in 2019, my late husband was diagnosed with brain cancer, very suddenly, very out of the blue, without a lot of symptoms, very outwardly symptoms at least, very healthy individual. And we are fairly young, early 40s at the time. So it really took both of us by surprise. It really took us back. And we're really healthy individuals. And I had been with him since I was 24 years old. So I had been with him for a very long time. And we really grew up into our adulthood together. And we were just getting ready to start. We had been trying to start a family and had been on that journey before he got diagnosed. And so we had already gone through a few losses with some miscarriages, and we started the adoption process thinking, we don't really care how we become parents. We just want to become parents somehow and be a mom and a dad. And so we spent 2.5 years on a waiting list, and which is aggravating in and of itself to have to wait so long to be chosen to be parents. And we finally got picked. We went through the entire process of her pregnancy with her. We were actually planning the baby shower when he was diagnosed in August of 2019. We already had the baby's room set up and had just done a gender reveal. So we knew we were having a little girl. And then he got diagnosed with brain cancer at 44 years old. So that kind of began the journey of what then would be every day of our lives, for the rest of our lives, for the rest of our relationship. It became this journey of trying to keep him as healthy as possible, knowing the circumstances of the type of diagnosis he had. When he was first diagnosed, when you're told you have glioblastoma, because there's various forms of brain cancer, but when you're told you have glioblastoma, the first thing I can tell people is never ever try to Google it or go to WebMD, because the statistics just will scare you.
Okay.
So I immediately had in my mindset, don't do that. Rely on the doctors, rely on pages, groups, things that you can find that are not just based statistics. But we were told pretty immediately that maybe he would get 3 to 5 years, maybe. And that was very jarring to hear.
Maybe based on what?
Just how well he did during treatment.
Okay.
If there were clinical trials that we could get him into, how well he tolerated, the type of treatment he would be given. Unfortunately, with glioblastoma, and that has changed, I will say, it has changed in the last 3 years from when he was first diagnosed. That's how far, the community is really starting to come and push. But when he was diagnosed in 2019, there wasn't a whole lot yet available. There was one clinical trial that we literally missed by 1 week that he probably could have gotten into. And that was really about it. There were a couple of other things that were coming down the pipeline, but they weren't available very regularly, even within a driving distance. We were willing to go wherever we needed to. I even told his oncologist, we'll fly to Germany, we'll go wherever we have to go if we can find something that can just prolong his life, but give him still a great quality of life. He still wanted to function on a regular base. And he actually did do very well they were able to get a big majority of the tumor out during surgery. He recovered absolutely beautifully. We're both cyclists. Within 5 or 6 weeks, not even, of his brain surgery. So from the minute he only had one brain surgery for most of his journey, within 4 to 6 weeks, he was cycling. He literally went and got on his bike, went out on the road and did a 25-mile ride. So that was how well, he was just so strong and so resilient and so responsive. And so, for the first 6 or 7 months, things were going very, very well, but it was definitely a struggle day to day. And it was, when you're dealing with a diagnosis like that, not every cancer is different. So every cancer journey is different. The type of drugs you have to use. With brain cancer, you had to be on a steroid for the first 3 months because of being prone to seizures. And the steroid really took a toll. Him being on steroids changed his demeanor, it changed his personality, like steroids do. And so that was a very dark period. It was a very hard time. For the most part, it was just the two of us. His family came out whenever they could, but they live about 3 hours away. My family came out whenever they could to support and help. We had friends that would kind of come in and out, but it was the two of us together 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And him being on the steroids, I knew he was in there. I knew my humble, sweet, loving husband was in there, but I knew the steroids were doing a number on him. And so when he was able to wean off of those, you could see him just come right back again. And that, he was just himself and he felt relaxed and he felt better. And he did really well until probably July, August of 2020, which almost a year to the day of when he was first diagnosed, he started to slip and he started to have more seizures. He started losing weight fairly rapidly. He started having trouble walking, and they couldn't figure out what was going on because his MRI had just been a couple weeks earlier and it was showing no evidence. It was showing that everything was as stable as it was 2 months prior. So we couldn't figure out what was going on. And his oncologist really thought it was just his anxiety, that it was from the chemo and that he was just so stressed out that it was causing kind of a domino effect. And something in my gut just kept saying, no, I think that there's something else going on. There's something hidden that you guys aren't seeing. And they kept wanting to throw medicine at it. We'll put him on an anti-anxiety med. We'll put him on this. This is going to help him. And he kept throwing up every time he ate. So I finally just took him into the emergency room, and I ignored his oncologist, and I reached out to another neuro-oncologist at the hospital, at the cancer center, because I trusted him and I valued him. And I said, I think there's something more going on. And sure enough, they did a spinal tap and found out that the cancer had spread from his head into his spine, which is very, very rare. So on top of having a rare cancer to begin with, it spread into his cerebral spinal fluid, which is extremely rare. Because glioblastoma, brain cancer in general, usually doesn't metastasize. It doesn't normally, it stays kind of confined.
Okay.
So that really took us by surprise. And from that point on, there was really not much you could do. And within 2 months, he was gone from that. So from start to finish, he had 14 months. So that was really hard. Because there was so much hope going into his diagnosis, and he was kind of being held up as a poster child for how well he was doing, and the fact that the tumor, what was left, had shrunk so drastically, and then nothing was showing up. We really thought, okay, he might be the one to get 5 years, maybe 10. And I'll be honest, I have met patients since who are 7 years out, 5 years out, 3. So it is possible. And we really thought that that would be him. And it just, for whatever reason, it wasn't. And so at 45 years old, he passed away, October of 2020. And that kind of set me on a new course for trying to find my way. He was kind of, I always used to say he was my rudder. He was my compass. He was my home. So when that gets yanked out from underneath of you, it takes quite a while to figure out, to kind of navigate your way and become your own.
Take a moment, because even as you're speaking this, and this was just 10 minutes where you're sharing your story and sort of tracking that as a person listening, and as me listening to that story, there's multiple things that already stick out for me as a practiced listener. Multiple things on that loss journey. I mean, the losses before, but then the prognosis. And what I've recently found out in my research is that, I always thought that we are a death avoiding society, but in fact there is something in the brain that avoids us, that shields us from accepting death as a reality towards ourselves. So when you get a prognosis like that, it's as if this illusion is disillusioned. So then you suddenly realize, okay, the death is not just something somewhere far out and not usually happens to other people, but actually it happens to us. And you just have a time until it is for sure going to happen. Right. And so that impending death, there's anticipatory grief, there is uncertainty, there's trauma of living that time, never knowing what's going to happen. There's always hope. But then also you mentioned also the losses and the challenges that you two faced before already. So there's a lot. And then just the last thing you mentioned, he was your rudder. He was, that's really symbolic. So how do you live a life without a rudder? How do you live without that man in your life that you have been growing up in your adolescence?
Yeah. For me, it was learning to be my own compass, my own rudder, learning to be my own foundation, knowing that one of my pillars was gone, learning to do that on my own and be comfortable with that. And that took a lot. It's still a process. It's still ever going. And for me, going to counseling was a big thing for me. Getting that support from somebody external to the situation was something that I really needed. And I always tell anybody who has had a bad experience with counseling or with therapy that it's like trying on a really good fitting pair of jeans, that just because they're a
Yeah,
licensed practitioner doesn't mean they're the best fit for you.
that's
And
a good
so
that's a
it
good
just like with
metaphor. Yeah.
doctors, yeah, I mean, you have to make sure that you find the right person that's going to fit you and the way you want to heal and the way you think the best. And that could take some time to find that person. And so I really navigated through interviewing and meeting different counselors until I found somebody that really matched the way I wanted to heal. And for me, a big part of that was not having somebody throw medication at me or say, I want you to go on this, or, oh, you're depressed, we're going to put you on an antidepressant. I wanted somebody to really help me dig deep and really heal the root of the problem instead of masking it just to get by each day. And that was a big deal for me. And so luckily I have found somebody like that. And I will say that during the pandemic, because he passed away in the height of the
Exactly.
pandemic, and to find a therapist in the middle of a pandemic was challenging, was very challenging because so many people were flocking to therapy at that time, especially virtually and looking for virtual counselors. It was not easy to find. There was wait lists. So there was a period where I had to find my way through before I could sync up with a counselor and actually start meeting with somebody. And I relied a lot on my faith and my support system at that point until I got linked with my counselor. And then I did go through a phase where my faith took a bit of a hit. I wasn't angry with the fact that he was gone. I knew that reality was there. I was more angry with how much we went through before he got diagnosed. And I was completely okay with the losses, the losing the babies and then losing the adoption after we'd already been chosen. We were planning the baby shower when he got diagnosed, and we lost the adoption because of his diagnosis.
Okay.
And I was okay with that. I was at peace with it. I said, we'll find a way to be parents. I'm okay with this because I had him. And ultimately, it was really just we have our love for each other. We have each other. We have our dogs. We have a roof overhead. We're okay. When I lost him, the enormity of everything else just kind of set in. And so my faith took a bit of a hit for a little while, and I have found my way back to it, and I do rely on it quite a bit for guidance, but I still have moments. So I think that was really what helped me start to find my way. And I still have moments and days where I still feel a bit rudderless and I still feel a bit wayward. But having that support, whether from the counselor or from my family or from my dear friends, having that with me and surrounding myself with that and forgiving myself and being kind to myself and understanding that it was okay for me to feel rudderless and lost. That really helped me start to kind of find my way through. And I had to learn to not think too forward, to not be so futuristic, because when you're young and you fall in love and you get married, it's all about the future. It's all about thinking about next year or the house we're going to buy or the family we're going to start and the trips we're going to take. And you always want to plan out. And the pandemic and his loss taught me to really appreciate being in the moment that you're in. And that also helped take away some of the feeling of being overwhelmed by being alone suddenly and not having my spouse anymore and being single again, living by myself in our house. I learned to not worry about anything more than the day that was in front of me and just to focus on what I needed to do for that day. And that really took a lot of weight off of me as well, because I didn't have to worry so much about next week, next year, 6 months from now. I just would focus on the day that I have in front of me and being grateful for what I did have in front of me that day. And I think that helps quite a bit too.
So you mentioned a couple of things, and I want to backtrack to something that me as a listener, I would want to know a little bit more about, because you mentioned your losses, you mentioned the miscarriages and the adoption that you lost because of his diagnosis. I mean, that would make me really angry, as if that is a reason to not have a child. Because if you were pregnant, it's not like suddenly that you say, oh, okay, diagnosis, you can't be pregnant. So that makes me a bit angry. But still, you said in there something interesting. You said, I was okay with that. And if we're backtracking a little bit, I would assume that it wasn't okay always. And I'm asking that, how did it come to that place where you can say, I'm okay with it? Because it's an interesting thing that happens in people's life. And I see it often as a metaphor of a path, and there's a fork in the road. And people make a choice over how they look or how they deal with what is presented to them. Because life happens, and there's often challenges that happen, and it's not always death and dying and trauma, but there's other things that happen. And there's a way that we can deal with that, or we can meet this. And that's the interesting thing, how people's psyche work with what they have been presented with. So I don't know if you can, but if you wanted to take us a little bit into Shannon's mind and Shannon's way of dealing with adversity, because you had plenty. So how do you come, I want to say, how did you come to, I'm okay with that loss?
It's a really good question. And before Mike was diagnosed, the very first time we got pregnant was a couple of years before he got diagnosed. And we had been trying for 5 or 6 years. I mean, we'd been trying for a while, only to find out that there was nothing wrong with either one of us. It was, for some reason, it was just a challenge. And it just wasn't sticking. So I started doing holistic acupuncture, infertility acupuncture. And ironically, that was how I was getting pregnant. And we had done some other treatment options. We did IUI, which is the step before IVF. I had chosen, and we had many conversations around it, but I had chosen not to go the route of IVF because I felt like I was pushing my body too much as it was. So for me, it was, I want to be as natural as possible. And if for some reason my body just doesn't want to have a baby, I'm not going to force it to have a baby, because that's just going to cause a lot of other issues. And again, that's where my faith really came in. I really had to trust the universe. I had to trust my faith that whatever was meant to be was meant to be. The first time we got pregnant, I remember not feeling well the whole weekend and feeling really nauseous. And I didn't realize how far along I already was at that point because I wasn't thinking. And I still actually have the picture on my phone from the positive pregnancy test. And I came running down to the office and I just set it down in front of him and I didn't say a word. And the look on his face, he was just over the moon. And he just kind of looked at me. He's like, are you serious? Did you take another one? And I'm like, I'll take another one later just to confirm. And then we went into the infertility clinic and they monitored us from that point on. And we were actually able to have an ultrasound with that one to see how far, how well the baby was progressing. And it was probably a week after that first ultrasound that I miscarried. And I was devastated. I miscarried fairly naturally with all three. So, which is helpful, but it's also painful. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we got pregnant 2 more times. And I think the reason I was okay with it at that point, and not okay, I was really upset and I was scared. But we also knew we were going to be going through the adoption process. We had already started the paperwork.
Oh, okay.
We had already done the orientation. And Mike and I had many conversations. And we knew that ultimately our goal was to be parents. And we didn't really care how we came about it. We just wanted to be parents. And yes, I wanted to get pregnant. but it didn't have to be that way. And so if this was God or the universe's way of saying, you're going to be parents, it's just, it may not come naturally. You may not have your own child. I was okay with that as long as it ultimately came to fruition. And what helped me out a great deal too was Mike's mentality around it. Because a lot of times women feel that they're broken, that there's something wrong with them. And if they can't physically bear the child of their spouse, they feel like their spouse will blame them for not giving them, a child with their DNA. And, or if there's something wrong with the husband. And so we had a lot of conversations, and I asked him, I said, would you regret this down the road? Would you blame me possibly down the road for not being able to bear your child if that doesn't, even though there was nothing wrong with me and I did all kinds of surgeries and there was nothing wrong with him. I said, is that something that could be an issue that we need to work through? And he said, absolutely not. And he looked at me and he held my hand and he's like, look, I didn't marry you for you to bear my children. I married you because you're the love of my life and my best friend. So that really helped a great deal because I knew that we were in a good space. We were communicating. It was healthy. We were both on the same track with wanting to just be parents. And that was the most important thing to us. And so that value that we shared between us, that really helped carry me through the miscarriages.
Yeah.
And even when we lost the adoption, that was very, very hard for both of us. That was an extremely difficult period. And we did not want to let go of that baby. And the birth mother actually called us privately. We had a separate cell phone for her because it was a semi-open. So it wasn't a fully open adoption process. So she called the cell phone after the adoption agency pulled the adoption, and we'd already put money into, we lost quite a bit. And she called us and said, I don't care about his diagnosis. I still want you guys to be the parents of this baby. And she was willing to do private adoption. It took us, we had many discussions. We waited till after his surgery. We waited till after he started treatment to kind of see where things were falling. But there was no way. She was in a different state, fairly far away. It would have meant me leaving him to go down and be there for weeks on end to finalize everything, to bring the baby home. And I couldn't feasibly, it was like, it was tearing me apart. It was literally pulling me in two different directions. And I had to make a choice. Do I try to pay thousands of dollars for a private attorney and make this happen and be away from the love of my life in the thick of his treatment so that we can bring home a newborn while he's going through this? Or do I sacrifice and let this go to focus on him? And my love for him outweighs everything else. And so I was willing to say, okay, if we're not meant to be parents right now or at all, I need to be with him. And he said the same thing, and it gutted us. And she did, when the baby was born, she sent us a picture, which killed me and him. But again, all that mattered was that he was stable and doing okay. And as long as he was still with me, I was okay with all of this other loss. Once he was gone, I think that's when I started to struggle with, if you knew, and I was kind of talking to God, talking up to, the heavens. And I said, if you knew that you were going to take him, if you knew this whole time that he wasn't going to be here, why would you not let me have a piece of him before all this happened? Why couldn't I just have a piece of his DNA, a piece of him still here? And so I did struggle with that in the beginning. And I still think about the little girl often that we lost, and how she's doing or where she is. And there is still a part of me that in the midst of all of this, in the midst of his death and me trying to transition, I haven't let go of the notion of being a mom. I have no idea how it'll look or how it'll present itself, but that goal is still there for me. I just don't think about how it's going to happen anymore. I just have hope that hopefully one day I will be allowed to be a parent. I just don't know how it'll look. But I think that that's really the only piece that I found with it, is that for some reason, for whatever reason, it was meant to kind of fall the way that it has. And I can't ask why, and I can't be angry, because it is what it is, and it's not going to change what happened.
But I think the interesting bit in what you're showing, and that I had a conversation with Amber as well, that you have spoken to, who also lost her husband through glioblastoma. So the interesting thing is, when you say, I can't be angry, yeah, you could. And there are people out there who probably say, yeah, I am angry. And so it's, I think them being angry is not wrong, as neither is you not being angry. It's just a different way to be with what is. And what I say often is, grieving is felt in all different ways. And sometimes it comes in the form of anger, and sometimes it comes in the form of helplessness and hopelessness and despair. And sometimes it comes in the form of what we term depression. So, it's an umbrella word for many emotions that are actually also grieving. But the interesting thing is that something in you, now almost 2.5 years out of the loss of Mike, have found a way to say, this is how it is. And so I'm putting words into that, but tell me, what are your words? And to make meaning from it, or to create something for yourself. Because, yes, you describe Mike as the center of your life, your rudder, your compass. And now, 2.5 years later, you are not just still sitting in your bed and saying, this life isn't worth without Mike.
Right.
So tell us about your process of making something out of what life has given you.
I will say that for everybody who's listening, it has not been a seamless journey where I just say, okay, this is what it is.
Exactly.
When he first died, I wasn't, and this is, again, it is just for me, everybody's journey is their own journey. I wasn't angry because I knew that if I held on to that anger for me personally, it wasn't going to do me justice, because it already was what was. It had already happened. What I will say is that I was really scared, and the unexpected feeling that came up for me was vulnerability. I felt really, really, and that is not something that's talked about a lot in grief. But I felt so vulnerable after he died. And I was determined. I did not want any other relationship to change. I didn't want to lose anybody. I wanted everything to kind of stay the same after he passed away. And I did suffer a lot of the losses. I suffered the loss of some of my in-law family, which I did not expect at all. There was some blame that took place in my direction, which I have not been able to understand. And I lost a couple of friends throughout it. And I will say that for me, some of it was I was holding on so tight to everything and everybody that was around me, because I didn't want anything else in my orbit to change. I slept on the couch for a year. I would not go upstairs and sleep in our bedroom for a year, which helps the neck and the back. Great. Not the greatest thing to sleep on the couch. I did eventually work my way up, but what I found through the process of going through all of these emotions and all of this loss was that I needed to find purpose. For me, I needed to find purpose. I had to find a way to take everything that I had been through and help others. And that was just something that had always been a part of me, even when I was younger. Whenever I felt lost or I was really struggling with something, I turned around and I either volunteered in the community, or I joined a committee, or I helped at a senior citizen home, or I joined AmeriCorps. I always ended up doing something to help other people because it was the only thing, it was just kind of ingrained in me. It was part of my DNA. And that was what I leaned on. That was what I fell back to was, okay, who was I before I met Mike? What did I use back then that can help me now? And the first thing I thought of was, well, I'm a speaker, I'm a writer, I was a radio host. What can I use to find a way to help others? And that was kind of how I transitioned into developing my podcast about brain cancer advocacy and grief and loss and being a young widow. There were not a lot of support systems. There's still not a lot of support for young widows. And so I wanted to have a voice. I wanted to be a voice for others and give others a chance to share and tell their stories. But it also was a way for me to heal, because if I was helping others, that empowered me. And so that really kind of helped me channel my energy into something good to come out of the enormity of everything that was lost. So that was really what started kind of the pendulum swing into the direction of finding my footing again. And it also showed me the amount of strength internally that I had, which I knew I was tough. I knew I was a strong person. I didn't realize how strong I was until all of this.
But I think staying on the couch for a year is also, I don't know, I'm asking you, but what do you think would have happened if you went to the bedroom? Was it a way to titrate the enormity of the grief, or was it a way to be strong and say, this is as much as I can take? What was the reason? What would have happened if you went to the bedroom?
It was both. It was both. Honestly, I did go up a couple of times, and the amount of anxiety I felt just by sitting on the edge of the bed, the fact that if I woke up in the morning and opened my eyes, he wasn't right there next to me, I couldn't do it. I just could. And plus the baby's room was right across the hall.
Okay.
So the crib and everything was right there. So I knew, I knew my limitations, and I knew that right now what I need is to just sleep downstairs, have the TV on, have my dogs with me. And that's where I felt safe. I did have to work my way. My counselor and I really worked on integrating me back upstairs a little at a time. And so I would go up and I would sit in the room for like 5 minutes. I'd put a timer on. I'd sit up there for 5 minutes. I'd get up, I'd walk out. And I would keep doing that. Or I'd go up, I'd grab my clothes, I'd take a shower, and then I would be done. And I did that a little at a time in order to start really reintegrating and reintroducing me and helping me deal with the triggers of being in that room. And eventually I worked my way up to, and I had to take a nap. So I went up there one day to take a nap just for half an hour. And so once I started to get to the point where that anxiety, and if I did start to feel anxious, I knew what to do. I had to really ground myself. I had to remind myself that I was safe and okay. I did some deep breathing. If I needed to leave, I could. And so that really helped me, but I also knew I had to face it. I had to work my way up to being up there again. And I'm glad that I did, because my back could not handle being on the couch anymore.
And you make such a beautiful picture for people to say, it doesn't have to be the bedroom. It can be life. It's like what you're describing is what I term, or what is termed in trauma. It's integrating back into your life. It's integrating your trauma back, or your grief, into your life by using titrated ways. Titration is the term that is borrowed from physics, where if you pour two liquids into each other, that would result in an explosion. But if you titrate them drop by drop, it gives an emulsified lotion or something. But you're describing just that for people to picture that whatever it is that they find challenging, to do it. So to build resilience, to step back into whatever it is that they are avoiding or that is too much. Yeah. And I think you painted such a beautiful picture, and thank you to your counselor or your therapist who obviously understood what she or he was doing with you or suggesting or encouraging you to do, but also for you to paint that picture for people listening, how you came to that, how you came to have the podcast, how you, and I think that's a topic that I see many times in my guests, that I wanted to help others to help myself, which is a very common way that people find their way into life and into a meaningful life again after loss.
It's healthy. I think it shows the resilience of being able to move through something like this, because whether we want to admit it or not, death is part of life. And if you're fortunate enough to make it into your 80s or your 90s, which most of the women in my family have gotten into their 90s. My great aunt was 101. The men, not so much, but it is a part of life. We're all going to experience it in some way, shape, or form. I think for some, it hits much closer to home than you want it to, but it is a part of life. And so that resiliency, having heart and finding compassion, not only for yourself, but in being able to recognize that this was the hardest journey ever. And if I had to experience this, and now I know all of these other people are experiencing this, gosh, what can I do to make it a little bit easier for them that I didn't have when I started this journey? And that's so empowering, and it's so freeing too, because it also forces you to face the fear of that bubble of closing off and of saying, okay, it happened. I'm not going to think about it. I'm not going to talk about it. I need to just move on. Well, no, instead, I really confronted it and just said, okay, this was always my fear, that something horrible would wreck this perfect, wonderful, amazing life that I have. And I faced it and decided that I don't want others to face it alone. And that's really empowering. And I think it shows the resilience of anybody who decides that that's what they want to do, is to try to help others. It really speaks to your heart. And I know that so many of us have it in us. We have that compassion and that love and that desire to want to just reach out and say, you don't have to do this alone. And I think that's what makes our world so beautiful.
You said the most important thing here that I think that I want to take away as a nugget here from today, before we then go into rapid fire question. It is that life is a series of events from birth to death. And although we can't make your challenges go away, the question is, and I think we're on the same track, you and I, is we are here for people not to be walking this path alone.
Yeah. Yeah. That is what it is. That's what makes us human beings. It's what makes us beautiful human beings.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story with us, and also how you transformed into where you are now.
Thank you.
A real inspiration. Thank you. Shall we go into rapid fire questions now?
Okay.
So grieving and trauma means?
Life. Grieving and trauma means life.
And healing means?
Love and compassion. Yeah.
And what I have learned about myself in the light of loss and trauma?
That I have more strength internally than I ever imagined, but that I also loved fiercely. And I would never, ever let that go or trade that in for what has happened. Even knowing what I know now, I would do it all over again, in spite of the loss and the trauma, because it also meant that I had the greatest love imaginable.
And one specific thing you wish people knew about loss and trauma, or specifically in your case of losing the center of your life, as you described, Mike?
Vulnerability really isn't talked about enough. And that was something I wish I knew going in was that I would feel such vulnerability, such nakedness after his death. And the fact that secondary losses are a very real thing. And I wasn't prepared for that. And so that is something that I wish I had known, that I want others to know, because that really impacts your healing.
Yeah. And one specific thing that has changed since your loss and trauma that you wouldn't want to miss?
The podcast. Starting Game on Glio and being part of the community that I am now part of, meeting all of the young widows that I have met on my journey. I would not want to trade that. That is a gift and a blessing that I never expected, in spite of everything. And so I am beyond grateful for this.
So go check out Game on Glio podcast. It's all in the show notes. If you want to listen to her podcast, I highly recommend it. So thank you so much, Shannon, for your time and for sharing yourself so openly and vulnerably.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me on. It's a beautiful, beautiful show, and one that I think many people should rely on.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to my newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.